Welcome to Prescribed by Dr. Nathan Goodyear, where integrative oncology meets holistic healing. This podcast is your home for the latest in innovation, exploration, and elevation in all areas of integrative oncology, medicine, health, wellness, and beyond. Join me and a host of other innovators as we go from practicing to prescribing. Your daily dose of wellness begins now. Dr. Nathan Goodyear here. Welcome to another Prescribed by Dr. Nathan Goodyear. In this podcast, we're going to talk about cancer stem cells. What I want to do in this podcast, whether it's solo, me just talking about a topic, or with experts in the arena of integrative oncology, or maybe superficially attached, I want to dive deep. I want to follow the science. I don't want to just follow what we've been told, but we always want to follow what the science is telling us. And so in that, there's a constant thirst for new information. And in that new information provides innovation and new discovery, and it's going to allow you, your family, your loved ones to be on the cutting edge of all things cancer and integrative oncology. So I want to talk about cancer stem cells. A lot of people talk about them. What are they? They are cancer cells with stem activity. Well, that implies there are cancer cells without stem activity, and that is correct. So what are cancer stem cells? Well, it's been a couple decades, first theory, and this theory has then turned into pretty much fact. But understand that, that concept that science has settled is by its nature unscientific. But what we're now starting to see is an evolution of our understanding of cancer stem cells. And that's what this topic is about today. Now, I did a hot take and you can find that over on YouTube, where it's a short condensed version of this. Even did a reel on this as well. Even if your attention span is even shorter than, say, 10 minutes or so, there it's about 90 seconds. So cancer stem cells don't play by fixed rules. They shapeshift. That's right. They adapt to their surrounding. They outmaneuver therapies on the intent and the purpose to survive. See, cancer stem cell paradigm has really proven to be a fact, but as I mentioned, the models are changing. One from the rigid hierarchy model, which was the original model, and the new dynamic plasticity paradigm. And we're going to go through them and even talk about the timeline and some of the evidence to support this. And of course, always check out the show notes where you will find the Research Rabbit access to your own rabbit hole to dive deep on the research. See, what we're seeing is a fundamental shift in how we preview and purview cancer stem cells. Now, this is important, and the reason why I got interested in this topic was because I was scrolling through social media, and there was a natural conference that was focusing on cancer stem cells, and they were implying in the title of this conference that cancer stem cells are fixed. They, by nature, are the copy that we want no backup of. We've got a backup of our computer, backup of our phone. These are backups that secure the data. In the same way, cancer stem cells, they can be a backup that secure data, but for a bad thing. But the concept has long been that it's fixed, that these are distinct cell populations. But now we're starting to understand, no, this model needs to shift to an adaptive model. Because we're better understanding that cancer cells, to survive, are constantly adapting to their environment, even treatment stressors. So let's go through the timeline here, the history timeline. See, understanding cancer stem cells only goes back about 20-25 years or so. And it began with that rigid tumor hierarchy, where there are two types of cells, cancers with stem activity and cancer cells without stem activity. Now, in 1997 to 2003, that was the dominant portion of the cancer stem cell hierarchy model. Bonnet and Dick in 1977 identified leukemic stem cells, so leukemia cancer stem cells. And this really was the apex of the tumor rigid fixed hierarchy. Now, in 2003, cancer stem cells in solid tumors, particularly here subpopulations, were shown in breast cancer, showing that this drove tumor growth. And again, you can check out the show notes for the specific references of this timeline and of these studies. 2008, cancer stem cell traits not fixed. This was the beginning of the pivot, the beginning of the shift, the beginning of the thought change, was looking at many of these tumors can actually acquire stemness, require stemness, meaning it's not something that is only deferred to certain cell types. They can be acquired or required. So that was 2008 when it began. And then the model was actually first introduced, that is the plasticity model of cancer stem cells, in 2009 with Gupta et al., showing the dynamic state of cancer stem cells in constant flux. 2011, experimental proof of plasticity, showing non-stem breast cancer cells can spontaneously revert to stem-like states. Let me repeat that. In 2011, Schaefer et al. Showed direct evidence that non-stem cell breast cancer cells, that is breast cancer cells without stem activity, can spontaneously, now not with pressure, but here, spontaneously revert to cancer cells with stem activity. 2015 to 2020, the plasticity really started to reach a fever pitch and became more of a consensus. Now we're in 2025, so 2017, they were showing that the dynamic equilibrium between cancer stem cells is regulated by epithelial to mesenchymal transition, the tumor microenvironment, and treatment stressors. So showing it's the outside environment that are putting stressors on different ways with the tumor, and the tumor in its own way is working to survive there. In two studies, 2017, really brought this into the consensus mind of most colleagues. But again, here we are 5 years later, from 2020 to present, where we're currently dealing in a mechanistic dissection, which is we're looking at the multi-omics. What's the specific mechanisms of actions genomically, epigenomically, transcriptomically, proteomically, metabolomically, hormonomically, immunomodulomically, and so on. There's constant epigenetic rewiring. The metabolic states, the immune interaction are all driving cancer stem cell plasticity. So it's not something that occurs only at these moments of rewiring, reprogramming, of metabolic or immune stress. It's occurring spontaneously, and it's occurring all the time. So let's look at these two models in detail. So let's go to the older model, the fixed hierarchy paradigm model, showing that, or displaying and discussing cancer stem cells as distinct fixed subpopulations. And the way I would describe this is a tree, and these cancer stem cells are the root of the tree, and the cancer cells that lack stem activity are the branches. Now, these cells demonstrate remarkable self-renewal capacity. They differentiate into heterogeneous progeny, means difference, not similar. And they possess very potent tumor initiation ability. So it's not just in the initiation of cancer, carcinogenesis, but it's also in the progression of cancer and the metastasis of cancer. Now, in this hierarchy framework, cancer cells lacking stemness properties function as differentiated progeny. They have reduced tumorigenicity. They have a more restrictive functional capacity, very fine-tuned in their focus in the model. And that cancer stem cells serve as the tumor propagating engine, and basically these are restricted to functional roles. So that is the fixed hierarchy paradigm that really dominated the first 20-25 years of cancer stem cells. But we're now moving beyond that model, and we're moving into the plasticity model, a dynamic stemness state, if you will. Now, other discoveries about cancer and the environment as it relates to it, and we're not just talking about the environment outside, we're talking about the environment inside, they've really driven a change in our understanding here. Tumor microenvironment. We no longer see cancer as a solid ball of cells isolated from the rest of the body. And the tumor microenvironment, this confluence of the cancer cells interacting with the non-cancer cells and everything in between, really is what is precipitating some of the pivot here and the force pressures to induce stemness acquisition. It influences that process whether it's spontaneously or via stressors. There are also therapeutic pressures. When you jump right into cancer treatment, whether that be surgery, chemotherapy, which in a few minutes we'll go into greater detail as to the impact of that on the plasticity model of cancer stem cells, these therapeutic stressors will apply pressure that is the cancer stem cells to adjust, to survive. And of course, there's epigenetic reprogramming, because what we're not seeing here is genomic changes. That is the actual DNA change. We're seeing the exchange, we're seeing a change in the expression of DNA. See, this is a very powerful thing. Epigenetics, it means above genetics. The very thoughts that we make, the very food that we eat changes our genetic expression. What I tell people is the food that you eat is basically a love language or not with your genetic code. Feed your body healthy, nutritional food, and don't be surprised if the epigenetic expression you get from that is equally healthy. But this epigenetic reprogramming causes the ability to switch rapidly phenotypically. So I talked about genotype or genome, that's the genetic code. The phenotypic is the expression of that genetic code. So the phenotypic switching means that through the change in genetic expression, we're actually seeing a rapid switch in phenotypic expression on top of that epigenetic expression. And so the mounting evidence really has become a consensus in that this process of cancer stem cells is not fixed, but in fact dynamic. It's in fact highly adaptable, highly plastic, and highly reprogrammable. And we think about reprogramming, basically what cancer does. But here, we're turning it on its head. Reprogramming cancer stem cells to stem activity. So cancer cells without stem activity into cancer cells with stem activity. But I'll tell you, the research is also applying to reprogramming to go the opposite way. What if we could actually reprogram cancer cells to non-cancer cells, irregardless of cancer stem cell discussion? That's a topic for another day. See, non-cancer stem cells can actually acquire and reacquire cancer stem cell-like traits. So for example, epithelial to mesenchymal transition. This is some of the mechanisms by which cancer can actually move from an immobile state to a mobile state. So epithelial cells tend to be more immobile. Mesenchymal states or characteristics tend to be more mobile. So if a cancer is going to go from immobile to mobile, it's going to go through this process of epithelial to mesenchymal transition. Equally, if a cancer needs to go from immobile, or cancer cells go from mobile to immobile, it's going to go through the opposite, which is mesenchymal to epithelial transition. This plasticity paradigm positions stemness as a functional state, not a fixed state, but a functional state, allowing these cancer stem cells or cancer cells without stem activity to adjust, to pivot bidirectionally based on phenotypic switching to adapt to the environment around it. And the environment, again, doesn't mean just outside, though that can be definitely the case, but we're talking about here primarily within the body. It's a 2009 article, Cancer Stem Cells, Mirage or Reality. Check that out in the show notes. Now, this concept of cancer cell plasticity, if it was an isolated phenomenon in biology, I would say, well, let's just hit the pause button because this is the first time this has been proven. Yet, because this is just the one other example in a long line of this plasticity or adaptability, it really affirms this idea of adaptability across multiple cell types. So let's go through other examples where this is proven to be true to provide strength in this conclusion. First, macrophage plasticity. I've talked about these before. Macrophage type 1, macrophage type 2. These are immune cells, antigen presenting cells. Macrophage type 1 are anti-tumor, macrophage type 2 are pro-tumor. And they actually promote tumor growth and actually angiogenesis. But what happens in cancer in many ways, it'll recruit immune cells to it, and then it'll use those immune system or convert those immune system or adulterate those immune cells to support itself at the detriment of the rest of the body. So a lot of times you'll see macrophages, particularly the type 1 subtype, they'll get recruited to the tumor and tumor microenvironment. The hypoxia and the iron content of that environment actually shifts the M1 to M2, and it creates a immunosupportive anti-tumor or pro-tumor environment. Now, this is parallel to cancer stem cells in every way of this adaptation to the environment. Here, what's driving the macrophage plasticity or the phenotypic switching is inflammatory signaling such as interleukin-6 and transforming growth factor beta. Another immune cell called neutrophil, what's called neutrophil plasticity, N1 and type N2. So the same kind of process where N2 or neutrophil type 2 subset are pro-tumor and N1 are anti-tumor. Here, transforming growth factor beta is promoting the same shift, environmental influences, causing a phenotypic switch to N2 subtypes of neutrophils. So here, another, again, parallel to cancer stem cells. What about T cell or T lymphocyte plasticity? Here's a shifting between different lineages, primarily between what are called effector cells and regulator cells. So effector cells would be things like Th1, Th2, Th17, back up a little bit. It's the shifting between the T effector cells like CD8, cytotoxic T lymphocytes, and the T regulating. Okay, we're going to cut right here. We're going to go back to T cell plasticity. Okay, so another example of immune cells showing great plasticity is T cell plasticity. Here we have a shifting between various lineages of T lymphocytes. Primarily here we're talking about T effector versus T regulating cells. So T effector cells are cells such as cytotoxic CD8 T lymphocytes, and then T effector cells would be things like T regulating cells. So here what we see is parallel to cancer stem cells, the T plasticity, T cell plasticity, is toggling between effector or regulator. And it's exactly what cancer stem cells or cancer cells are doing, is they shift between stem or non-stem like activity. Again, allowing it to adapt to the challenges submitted upon it. Then the epithelial to mesenchymal plasticity. And I also talked about the mesenchymal to epithelial translation or transition. So one is going from immobile to mobile, and the other is going from mobile to immobile. Now the EMT or epithelial to mesenchymal transition, it is inducing stem-like properties, whereas the mesenchymal to epithelial stem transformation is actually occurring in a more non-stem cell or restoring differentiation. And then even looking at fibroblast plasticity, cancer-associated fibroblasts. These are highly plastic, actually functioning in a variety of different ways, showing tumor-restricting myelofibroblastic cancer-associated fibroblasts, and then tumor-promoting inflammatory cancer-associated fibroblasts. So here's the take-home here. Though this is parallel to cancer stem cells with these fibroblasts, again, also with transforming growth factor beta and interleukin-6, these are still the same cells. Whether it's cancer cells, whether it's macrophages, whether it's neutrophils, whether it's T cells, whether it's epithelial mesenchymal cells. That's more of a fluid nature there, or of cancer-associated fibroblasts. It's not that we're dealing with different subsets of populations. We're dealing with the same cell types, but we're resulting, because of the stressors of the environment, a pivot of those cell types to a variance of the cell type to allow it to adapt and survive best in that context of that different environment. And then again, epithelial to mesenchymal transition and mesenchymal to epithelial transition is really just an example of how this process would actually occur. Go back here to the slide, because I want to talk about this, because cancer stem cell plasticity, it aligns with a broader biological principle of context-dependent cellular state. Just look at us. We're not static. We're not fixed. Every aspect of our micro level of cell and beyond is adapting to its environment. These cancer stem cells adapt phenotypically to the environmental stressors that we provided, whether intentional or not, and then whether it's applied via therapeutic stressors as well. So what it really brings to the forefront is that by taking an approach of cancer treatment, and which is what we've had primarily for the last 75 years in cancer, which is going to war, we're eliminating or targeting one state of a cell that doesn't really exist. And so what can happen is we can actually induce the induction or acquisition of cancer stemness, and in turn lead to the very thing that we're trying to eradicate, which is recurrence and widespread metastasis. And we'll go through the unholy trinity as I describe it and how that contributes to this process as well. So what are the therapeutic implications here of looking at the targeted fixed of the tumor hierarchy model, the older one, as well as the new plasticity model? Well, the fixed hierarchy approach, looking at the targeting of the cancer stem cells, which I would tell you doesn't work, it would say, well, we're looking at surface markers. We're looking at key signaling pathways, like Notch, like Hedgehog, and like WNT or Wnt. These are not just cell surface proteins, but also internal signaling. And so the thought here is that we can decapitate, cut off the tree from the root. That's the fixed philosophy. And we really know that doesn't work. This is a very plastic process. So looking at the plasticity-informed strategy, we do want to target cancer stem cells, because in just a second, I'll talk about and target how some cancer stem cells do express certain proteins that we should try to target, but we can't target that alone. We must also equally, and probably I would say more effectively, target the plasticity. And here it's going to be the proteins, but also signaling pathways. But beyond that, we have to target the environments, the pressures, the strains that are actually causing the pivot of cancer cells without stem activity to cancer cells with stem activity. We have to target the tumor microenvironment, which, by the way, at the Williams Cancer Institute, that's exactly what we do. We go right into the tumor to change the tumor microenvironment from one where most solid tumors exist in the majority form in cold, not allowing the immune system in, creating an immune desert environment, and actually causing a shift where immune cells can get in and actually create a hot environment, allowing the immune system to infiltrate and be activated against the immune system. We have to understand we must target the stress responses, again, whether internally or induced by treatment, and then also metabolic rewiring. So we have to look at things like transforming growth factor beta, interleukin 6. By the way, at the Williams Cancer Institute, we are targeting those non-stop because they are key drivers, especially advanced disease, of advanced phenotypic reprogramming to accelerate. And so we can then reprogram or re-reprogram cancer cells to a less intensive growth state, or maybe even a non-malignant state. So the plasticity model better fits with what we're understanding in the biology and the science. And even successful cancer stem cell elimination likely is insufficient, as surviving non-cancer stem cells can acquire the ability to obtain stemness. So we may knock out cancer stem cells by targeting, but if we don't target the plasticity, those cancer cells with non-stem activity, they will acquire or revert to stemness and thus go right back to that copy that we just got rid of. So this paradigm necessitates a combination approach, and we can't look at things in an isolated manner, which is what this social media post was describing, nor in a sequential manner. And in so doing, this is a higher cognitive function where we're taking complex processes and breaking them down. We must resynthesize them to the impact on the whole. See, cancer is functioning on a level of quantum physics. We can't try to treat that high level activity, or here plasticity of cancer, by going, well, let's try treatment A and let's try treatment B, as if cancer goes, oh, I never saw treatment B coming, you got me. That's just not the case, obviously. So let's talk about some of the common surface markers of cancer stem cells. Now, I think it's important here to state this right out of the gate. When identifying cancer stem cells, the expression varies greatly based on the type of cancer, the stage of cancer, and the cellular context, meaning the environment. So let's go through just a few examples. And I think it's important to state that there's no clear, defined surface marker of stem cells that matches or is uniform across all cancer cell types, no matter what the name is. So first example of a cancer stem cell marker would be CD133 or promenade 1. This is a widely studied cancer stem cell biomarker, and it's been found in brain, colon, pancreatic, and liver cancers. It's been associated, as is cancer stem cells, with self-renewal and treatment resistance. So I've talked about recurrence and metastasis, but treatment resistance also is another component by which cancer stem cells play a big role. And of course, treatment resistance is a big issue. Another biomarker for cancer stem cells is CD44, also seen in breast, pancreatic, colorectal, head and neck cancer stem cells, influencing or affecting invasion and migration. That's exactly what cancer does. ALDH activity, that's ALDH activity found in breast, ovarian, lung, and colon cancer stem cells. So cancer-specific examples of these biomarkers in cancer stem cells have been found in breast, colorectal, brain, liver, pancreatic, prostate, ovarian. And there's a slide associated with this, so we'll try to pop this up right in front of you if you're watching this online. If you're just listening to it, check out the show notes. So the key caveats here is that this marker heterogeneity, there's no single biomarker that is universally accepted or exclusive to define all cancer stem cells. They vary by tumor type, stage, and environment. This process is very plastic, very malleable, very adaptable, and it's definitely not fixed. In essence, what this new model shows is that cancer blurs the boundaries. So when we think within walls, when we isolate our thinking by only thinking within the box or within the boundaries, cancer doesn't work that way. It works outside those boundaries. This is why innovation is so important. And this is why I am at the Williams Cancer Institute with Dr. Williams, because we are innovating to elevate and empower the body to heal. So let's look at the vision and the origin of what I would say was that tumor hierarchy rigid process and the reality of what we see in the plasticity model. I've talked a lot about Paul Ehrlich, early 20th century magic bullet theory, where he was looking for the treatment of a disease with one chemical. So one chemical therapy for a disease, a one-for-one strategy. This is actually where the word for chemotherapy came from. It had nothing to do with cancer. He was looking at the treatment of syphilis with salvaricin. Had nothing to do with cancer. It wasn't until the 40s and 50s that that process really became equatable to cancer. So the concept here of this Paul Ehrlich's magic bullet is assume that cancer is very homogeneous. They're all clones, they're all the same, and stable targets can be eliminated in a very linear, stepwise manner. And I've already said, can't look at it that way because that's not the way the cancer thinks. That's the way we can think, but we have to break through those limitations of thinking and understand better how cancer works. Cancer is heterogeneous. It's very different. We actually even know that if you look at 5 different tumors in the liver, guess what? They're going to be heterogeneous within each tumor, but also within those 5 different tumors, but also the immune environments around those 5 different tumors are going to be different, heterogeneous. So this cancer stem cell plasticity or dynamic reality, it reveals that cancer is a dynamic, heterogeneous, plastic, adaptable, reprogrammable, interconvertible process involving cancer stem cells and many other cells. Of course, cancer cells without stem activity also. Again, it's plastic. It's influenced by the tumor microenvironment, influenced by the treatment pressors that we provide in treatment. The single magic bullet theory approach here just does not apply. It doesn't apply in causation and it doesn't apply in treatment either. So what we have here is what is so often the case in complex issues is oversimplification. And you see this in medicine where what happens is there's a very complex issue, and to understand it or explain it, it's oversimplified. But in the process of oversimplification, what happens is you start to take it off the rails of reality. This is something that in medicine we do far too often as it relates to cancer. People try to say, well, cancer is a easily identifiable process. Here's how you target. I would love to tell you that cancer can just be treated by cutting sugar out of your diet, by balancing your immune system, by helping your gut microbiome, by reducing your stress, by taking this supplement, by doing this or by doing that. But that's not the case. That's not the case. Again, we oversimplify. All of those things can be wonderful and very helpful in a combination strategy. And understand that's always the best way to target cancer, stacking therapies together. Because cancer is stacking dysfunction upon dysfunction upon dysfunction upon dysfunction. And if that's not enough, it goes and brings your cells and says, you join in the party and you create more dysfunction. That's right. Cancer uses your cells, doesn't convert them to cancer cells all the time. It actually uses your cell to do the dirty work. So the classic view is that cancer stem cells are stable, predictable, and that progress of cancer from invasion to metastasis is a very sequential process. We now know that to be completely untrue. We now know that when cancer is invading and really invading and breaking through its just initial process into the arena of cancer, it's already spreading, and many of those areas will go dormant. This process came from a 1990 paper looking at the linear accumulation of colorectal cancer cells via mutations in what's called Vogelstein's colorectal cancer model. And again, it's trying to explain the process, but as we try to explain it, we oversimplify it and we lose context of that within the complexity of the biological system. I think what we need to do with cancer is first just say, cancer is insanely complex, more than we even understand. Okay, done. Sweep that aside, now let's get to work. So in this classic view, stable cells exist. That's the normal state. They don't flux, they don't pivot, they don't toggle. Progression is very predictable, sequential. And one mutation leads to one vulnerability, which leads to another, and so it's that sequential process. But in reality, as is always the case, life, look around you, it's complex. Would anybody describe relationships as fixed? No, they are dynamic, they flux, they are complicated. Yeah, cancer is no different. It's just that much more. So when we look at this plasticity model, we have to understand that this process, these cells are far from static. And here I'm talking about cancer cells with or without stem activity. They're complex ecosystems, highly heterogeneous, adaptive states. And they're shaped by constant pressure inside and out. So what has caused us to move away from this magic bullet theory to the plasticity model, away from the tumor heterogeneity cancer stem cell model to one of plasticity, is that we understand this process is more adaptable than previously thought. See, there is no fixed target. Targeting a cancer stem cell today will allow a non-cancer stem cell tomorrow to acquire or reacquire stem cell activity to replace the cancer stem cell that was destroyed. So that's why we have to target both the cancer stem cells, but most importantly, the plasticity. So it's the backup of the backup. This process requires dynamic adaptation because cancer proceeds through dynamic adaptation. It's constantly rewiring metabolism, epigenetic expression, immunomodulation. This process is in constant flux, and it does so to maintain growth, survival, and thriving. We like to think of thriving in terms of us, healthy, but cancer does the same thing. And then this phenotypic switching, it's a real-time phenomenon where cancer cells will pivot based on its needs at the moment in the context from stressors. The magic bullet paradigm, the tumor hierarchy model of cancer stem cells, it is defunct, it is broken. You can't hit a moving target with a single shot. These are cells that are moving from one end of the spectrum to another, called polarization. That's another way to refer to this, M1, M2, N1, N2. Cancer stem cells versus cancer non-stem. It's a polarization, polar opposites that it pivots through. You've got to address the dynamic, evolving nature of the environment that is driving this toggle. So why does the magic bullet fail? And why do we have to understand that what we're dealing with today is the plasticity model? I've already kind of touched on a few of these. Tumor heterogeneity, multiple clones, distinct cancer stem cell pools, variety, varied microenvironments. Even within a tumor, there's going to be multiple hypoxic areas. There's unique niches within the tumor. But then you get separate tumors and you get equally. It becomes an exponential process. Cells by nature are plastic, adaptable. That applies to non-cancer cells and to cancer cells, whether those cancer cells have stem activity or not. Cancer stem cells use the microenvironment to shield, to protect themselves. Hypoxic areas, acidic areas, all are being used in these microenvironment niches within the tumor microenvironment to allow it to evade immune system detection and destruction. And then finally, therapy, treatment, chemotherapy, surgery, radiation, it induces plasticity paradoxically. See, I say paradoxically because these treatments, the unholy trinity of surgery, chemo, and radiation, their intent, their purpose is to provide what everybody says, which is cure. Now, cure is not a scientific endpoint that's valid. We would better describe that as long-term overall survival, 5-year NED, that extends beyond that long-term overall survival. So the very therapy that we use, that we put our faith in, we put our trust in, that we seek to maintain and restore life, actually can set the stage for recurrence, resistance, metastasis. Now, why is that important? 90% of morbidity and mortality in cancer is when it spreads. So the very treatments to reach a cure can be the reason that leads to mortality itself. So let's go through surgery, chemo, radiation. Surgery is an unintended inducer of cancer stem cell plasticity. I want you to think of a concept of a tumor as a wound. It was first described this way in 1986 by Harold F. Dvorak. He published an essay in the New England Journal of Medicine entitled Tumors, Wounds That Do Not Heal. That title is how I want you to think of tumors. They are wounds that do not heal. So then let me ask you this question. If tumors by their nature are wounds that do not heal, what does surgery itself create? Wounds. So if we create wounds further in wounds that do not heal, this is not a case where where a double negative makes a positive. A wound within the context of a wound that does not heal perpetuates an unhealing wound. And that in its essence is what cancer is when it spreads and survives. So surgery induces and promotes cancer stem cell properties because of that wound aggravating process. Both surgical trauma, it enriches cancer stem cell phenotype and recruitment in these wound environments. It stimulates the epithelial to mesenchymal transition. And one example is the stimulation of what's called STAT3, or signal transducer and activator of transcription 3, which activates the progression of cancer. And it does so of stem cell activity in cancer cells via the epithelial to mesenchymal transition. So the take home here with surgery and cancer stem cells is that the very thing that is used to provide curative attempt in cancer is the very thing that can set the stage to alter the tumor microenvironment, alter the immune system I talk about otherwhere, and select out cells that are cancerous that can then pivot or retoggle to a non-stem activity to that which has stem activity. So we can restore the backup that we've then just cut out with surgery. And then at that point, likely lead to resistance, because whenever cancer comes back, it becomes a much difficult process to treat. Now, what about chemotherapy? I've talked a lot about chemotherapy, and I want to talk more about it. Chemotherapy does one thing really well. It kills rapidly dividing cells. The problem is rapidly dividing cells are not confined and are not inclusive to only cancer cells. They evolve cells outside of cancer cells. Immune cells are rapidly dividing. Gastrointestinal cells are rapidly dividing. This is why you see the off-target toxicity associated with those different areas. Immune cells, one is front and center in that. Gastrointestinal side effects, front and center of that. So the reason why chemotherapy can induce unintended consequences as it relates to cancer stem cell plasticity is that they are a selective pressure, enriching and inducing cancer stem cell induction. So cytotoxic induction of stemness. Cytotoxic is what chemotherapy does. It's cytotoxic, it's toxic to cells, induces its destruction. So if you're doing that, you're also selecting out cells' ability to pivot and adapt to survive. And some examples there are things such as monocyte-derived chemokines and epithelial-mesenchymal transition features directly contributing to this pivot, this toggle. MicroRNA-mediated reprogramming promotes stemness. And this has been shown actually in breast cancer. Again, check out the show notes for access to the article supporting that. Temozolomide, which is a chemotherapeutic used in glioblastoma, has been shown to enhance tumor stemness. Again, the very drug, that cancer in and of itself is very difficult to treat. And temozolomide has been a wonderful advancement in the ability to target this cancer, yet it induces stemness. So though it can provide short-term victory, if we're not targeting the plasticity, we're setting the stage for resistance, for recurrence, and even metastasis. And then broader, the induction, again, of resistance, being induced by the wound, being induced by epithelial to mesenchymal transition, and being induced by reprogramming. Now radiation, interesting enough, radiation is kind of the paradox within a paradox within a paradox. You know, radiation causes cancer, radiation is used to treat cancer, radiation causes secondary cancers, radiation causes recurrence, radiation causes metastasis. It's an unforeseen inducer of cancer stem cell plasticity, paradoxically, just like both surgery and just like chemotherapy, which are used in an attempt to cure. The big thing it can really also do is contribute to stemness that then induces treatment resistance with radiation. So this has been shown to occur via mechanistic pathways by looking at things like the Wnt, Notch, and hedgehog, just like the Wnt, Notch, and hedgehog pathway signaling, internal signaling, and the epithelial to mesenchymal transition, all promoting relapse and radiation resistance, and then awakening dormant cancer stem cells. I talked about how cancer spreads much earlier than we thought, and it goes out and forms distant metastatic sites that then go dormant. And in fact, primary tumors can actually create substances like angiostensin that actually suppress these distant dormant tumors. And then when you surgically remove that or treat via radiation these large tumors, you remove this dominant suppressive effect and you allow these dormant cancer stem cells or dormant tumors to awaken. And that's exactly how radiation can further contribute to this process. So radiation is also a paradox, inducing actually treatment resistance, treatment recurrence, and metastasis when it's a very therapy that is used to induce cure. So the new consensus is that this process of cancer stem cells, no matter what people say, check out the resources, check out the science, read it for yourself, go down your own rabbit hole. This process is dynamic. It's not fixed. These are not subpopulation, but these are actually cancer cells that per the context, per the environment, per the stressors, they're going to manipulate, they're going to adapt, they're going to pivot, they're going to toggle. And I've been repeating those same words because I want to help you to learn that this process is not dynamic. If we just target one cell, try to shoot a moving target based on the environment with one shot, we're going to miss. We got to target the plasticity. Understand the targets of cancer stem cells, because there are a few, but we have to target the plasticity because every cancer cell, in a way, is a stem cell, whether it's now or in the future based on the environment and the context. We need combination therapies. We need adaptive strategies. We need to quit thinking in protocols. We need to quit thinking in boundaries. We need to quit thinking with blinders. We're limiting ourselves, and cancer does no such thing. We must break down the boundaries that we limit our treatment, our thinking, and the outcomes for our patients. If we tell our patients, this can't be treated, this cannot be resolved. Why would we do such a thing? Why would we say such a thing? That has no bearing in health, that has no bearing in science, that has no bearing in what it means to be a physician or a doctor. And this is where, we have physicians, that word means healer. We have doctors, that word in Latin means teacher. There's this pivot to almost the concept of death. Now, death is a reality in life, of course. But it's like there's a bearer or a bringer of death. So it's not that this is healthcare, a new version of healthcare. It's something that's contradictory, paradoxical to healthcare, just like what we have with this context here. We might best call them mortifers, which are not physicians, not doctors, though they may claim to be. They do not practice healing, they do not practice teaching, they practice the bearers of death. Mortifers, morted meaning death, and fers meaning bringing forth. They bring forth death. We have to understand the complexity and the evolving ecosystems that manipulate this environment. So the new consensus here in closing is that cancer stem cells are dynamic. But it's not just they're dynamic because they're dynamic, because they can acquire stemness, that is cancer cells without stem activity, but they can do so without stressors, without stimulus. They can do it spontaneously. See, the signals of stressors and the therapeutic interventions help us to understand that what we're doing in that treatment to induce cure can actually be that which induces the recurrence, the metastasis, and the treatment resistance. So in terms of understanding the plasticity that we are then inducing in cancer stem cells, causing a toggle from non-stem to stem activity, we have to equally at that time target stemness. And that is the stacking of therapies that I'm referencing. This is an adaptive behavior that really is inherent to most cells, as I've highlighted many different cell types. It's a functional phenotype versus a fixed phenotype that cancer cells can acquire based on stressors or based on spontaneous activity. That is the science to date on cancer stem cells. One, a variable, plastic, reprogrammable, adaptable environment. It is in no ways fixed. As I said, it's complex. Okay, accept that. Now let's move on. But to move on, we have to break down the boundaries of our thinking, break down the boundaries of conformity of thought, and return to one critical of thought. Hope this has been an enjoyable podcast. As always, again, check out the show notes, take the deep dive on your own. Don't take my word for it. Check out the hot take. Hey, we need your help here. Over 90% of the patients and the people that watch this podcast, they don't subscribe. Now, that's a pretty standard issue across the industry. And so ours is equal to what's out there. To grow this movement, to help patients be the force vector of change, to restore cancer treatment back to what its purpose is, which is to heal and teach the body how to heal, we need subscribers. We need you to subscribe so that you can get updates when we drop these new podcasts, because we drop one typically every week, sometimes twice a week. And then share and subscribe this to others that you think would benefit from this type of information, whether that be yourself, family, loved ones, or friend. So we need your help, we need your partnership, and thank you for joining us on this Prescribed by Dr. Nathan Goodyear podcast. I will see you on the next podcast.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of the Prescribed Podcast. All references supporting this episode can be found on the prescribed.com website. That's pre-scribe.com. To get your next dose of medical innovation, make sure you subscribe to Prescribe. We'll see you for your next refill.